And welcome back as we go ahead and get ready to look at our next programming structure, which is that of the loop. And particularly, we're going to look at today the while and the do while loop. So the first thing we have to understand with loops is that we're addressing a common issue that we have up to now with our code, which is that of repetitive task. If we wanted to do a repetitive task in Java up to this point without loops, we'd have to write that code multiple times. We have to pretty much literally sequentially have it go through for how many times we want it to work. However, we can use loops to address this issue. Loops are a wonderful technique that allow programs to do repeatable tasks in steps known as iterations. There are three types of loops, of course, in Java. There is a while loop, a do while loop, and a for loop. Now, there is also a variation of the for loop known as a for each loop, but we'll explore that at a later time because it's going to require a little bit more understanding of other things that we haven't gotten to yet. Now, so let's first today start with looking at both the while loop and the do while loop because they are very similar in their structure and implementation. In a while loop, the Boolean expression, which is what controls the conditions of that loop to run, is checked before the loop body is executed. If that expression comes back as false, well, the code's going to fall out of the loop and isn't executed. In a do while loop, the code is executed once and then the Boolean expression is checked afterwards. Anything written with a while loop in Java can also be written with a do while loop and vice versa. Now, these Boolean expressions sometimes operate with what's known as a sentinel value. So let's just say we want our program to end with a specific input or let's say a range of values. This is what's known as a sentinel value, and we'll look at this with an example in a minute here, as it's going to act as the exit condition for that loop. Now, while a sentinel value isn't always, let's say, a negative number, because obviously that's a specific thing we can look at, but it needs to be a value that wouldn't be considered a quote-unquote real input. So it's something that's going to cause that loop to stop getting whether it's input or iterations of however it's going to execute. So let's just say, for example, we're getting a list of scores. They're going to be average. Well, we can use a negative number to act as that sentinel value because maybe those scores are all going to be numbers from 0 to 100. The Boolean expression would be, let's say, next is greater than or equal to 0. So we're going to look to see, hey, these are positive numbers. And if it's not positive, well, we want to end the loop properly by testing that Boolean before we add the numbers to be read. This, of course, prevents that sentinel value from being added to the sum for the average. Now, I said we're going to look at a specific example because, of course, negative numbers is one way to do it, but you can also test this with strings because strings have a little bit different way of handling this. And, of course, this is going to be an example of continuous input. And this is going to be a little more advanced because it's going to have some stuff that we aren't quite ready to talk about yet. But if we want to do something, let's say, get continuous input, if you look at this loop example, I say while true, string input equals kb.next line, system.println input. One of the things you'll notice is that right here is our while loop. This is the while constructor. We have a Boolean expression here. And the neat thing about loops is you can actually just put in a thing like while true, and it will automatically run that loop. But I could also replace that with something else. I could have this be an expression such as we saw, where the number is greater than or equal to 0. And that would be the Boolean expression that I would test there. Then, of course, we have just an input, and we're printing it out. Pretty simple program, all right? But if you look at it, there is a small flaw. How do we change this Boolean expression so that it becomes false? This loop will never exit in its current form. Now, there are ways that we could do this. We could have some kind of variable running in the background, for example, or we could modify it using a conditional statement that would change the Boolean. And when we get to the Eclipse, I'll show a couple other ways that we can handle this as well. So if we want to exit continuous input, all right, one of the ways we can do this, and this is harkening back to our conversation on sentinel values, is that we can use a word that we could test for. So in this case, the word exit. So we could say while true, string input equals kb.next line, system.println input, if input dot equals exit, and remember it's a string, so we have to use dot equals instead of equals equals, and then we have this word break. Now, if the word exit is typed, obviously the code would then exit the loop. And you'll notice, again, we are using this new keyword break. And for now, I don't want you to worry about what break means or how it functions. Just know that if you put break in there, it just means it's going to exit out of the loop. And we're going to explore this in more detail later on. All right, so here we are in Eclipse. Let's go ahead and write a couple of loops here so we can just go ahead and get a good handle on how these work. So, for example, let's just go ahead and do a continuous input for a string. So, I'm just going to add a continuous input here. So, continuous input example. And with this one, let's just go ahead and do while true again. And I'm going to do the same thing as what we did before, but I'm going to add a quick prompt here, system.out.println. Please enter a string. And then I can just do input equals kb.next line. And let's go ahead then and have it simply just output that. All right, and of course, this, if we remember, won't exit, right? It's going to continue running. So I'm just going to show this real quick before I add that break statement in there. So if I enter in a string, and you can see it's going to reprompt. So that's how loop works. It just takes it back to the beginning of the loop. And so if I enter another string, and another, and another, and another, you can see it'll keep going because it never gets the condition to exit. So we want to go ahead and add that condition in here. Now, like I said, we can do this is with the set num value, and there's two ways we can do this. I can use an if statement, like I showed in the example. So if input dot equals, and let's just go ahead and say the word exit. We're just going to add that break keyword in here. So if I run this, all right, if I type in, let's say, exit right away, you'll see it automatically exits that loop. So it only goes to that loop in one iteration. Whereas if I run this again, let's go ahead and just type the word break, that's fine here, and then we type exit, you'll see that it, of course, will go through one iteration. An iteration, of course, is just one complete run-through of this code that's within inside the curly brackets for this while loop. Now I'm going to go ahead and show this with a different type of set null value. And so if we go ahead and use, let's say, a numeric value to keep track of this. So let's just go ahead and do a continuous input again. And so let's just go ahead and say something such as we want to have this stop after 5 iterations. So do while num is greater than or equal to 0. All right, and let's initialize num up here to 0. Now, if I were to go ahead, and let's just take this one out, let's just do num plus plus. This loop, of course, in its current form, so let me just go ahead and just do exit here to exit that first string. And so this is our second string now. If I start typing in, let's see, things here, you can see that it's going to continue to loop. It never exits out because here, what do we have going on? Well, we've got num plus plus, that means it's getting greater, but look at our code here. Our Boolean expression says as long as this is greater than or equal to 0. So I would maybe want to change this to, let's say, num minus minus. And then you'll see with this one that if I enter anything, it falls out of that loop right away. So knowing your Boolean expressions are going to be very important for you to be able to control how these loops work. And so let's just say I'm going to change this real quick to 10 just so we can see this work here. And so now I'll just exit. And then if I do hello, and let's just say 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'll just keep going here. I'll even do numeric input. It's still going to treat those as strings. And then see I hit 10 now, and now it's fallen out of that loop because it's now going to be less than 0. So again, little things like that, you have to keep track of how you can do this. Or another thing I can do is a do while loop. So let's just say I wanted to do a do while loop. So do while loop is going to be a little different. So let's say I'm going to do, and I'm going to do the same input that I have up here. So let's just go ahead and add this in here. Okay. And what I want to do now is, let's say, have this do a while. So what is my Boolean expression here? So let's just say while num, let's switch this back around, is greater than or equal to 0. And with this one, it's a little different than we're used to. We're actually going to add a semicolon right here to the end of the while statement. So the curly brackets actually go here. And what this says is do this code first, and then do all this, and then do your loop. And I'm actually just going to change this to a plus plus, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to set num equal to -3, just so we can make sure that we have values that we can actually test here. And so now if I go ahead and do this, let's just add a comment here. It says input using a do while. And so if I enter a string here, so we'll just exit to go through that first one. So now we're in the second loop here. And so this, of course, will give us 10 iterations. So 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. This, of course, should give us our new string. And you can see how it passes through here. And what I'm going to do is just to help differentiate, I'm just going to go ahead and put a number here just so we can make sure we're seeing these properly. So let's go ahead and just do exit. See, now we're into this new loop here, so that's our do while. And num is -3 here, so it says please enter a string. So let's go ahead and just put in some strings now. So hello. And you can see it's fallen out of that loop because if you look, it says while num is greater than or equal to 0 here. So in this case, because it's greater than or equal to 0, and this is a negative number, it only goes through this loop once. But if I were to go ahead and change this to, let's see, to a negative, and I'm going to make this to 5 just so that it's easier for us to loop through this. So exit out of that, and let's do the first while loop here. And you can see now we, of course, are getting some inputs that we can put in here. And we can do another one. And now we've fallen out of that loop. So these are, of course, all different ways that we can do a loop here. And you can see there's some advantages that we can do with this. And we can start extending what we have here to doing other things. So for example, if I wanted to find, let's say, like we said, a scores, or maybe I want to find an average, or I want to add up a bunch of numbers, I can do that adding inside of the while loop. And then once it's done, I can exit out to go ahead and calculate that. So very, very helpful here with what we can do. And we're going to see a lot of these as we start moving forward.